Hi, I'm Christine. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm here with some historical fiction recs. So historical fiction is a genre that I have read for years and years. I've always loved them. I feel like this genre is definitely more possibly mainstream than maybe historical romances. And by that I mean I feel like so many people read historical fiction. Like I remember back in the day my mom would pick them up and read them. She would let me borrow them as well, and then we'd like talk about the books afterwards, which was like our own little book club, I guess. But I mean it like mainstream in that way that like so many people have access to historical fiction books and they're definitely more talked about, shared. I feel like so many adaptations have been made of them, like that kind of mainstream way. So I have always enjoyed them. I'm just a history lover at heart, and so I love learning things while I read. So today's video is a collab with Tori from Novel Life, and I'm so excited to see her video after this as well. I know that we're gonna have for sure one book the same that we've already talked about that we both are gonna be talking about, but I'm excited to see what other books she has as well. Tori is one of my book friends who I have gotten to meet and spend time with at multiple book signings now, and I just adore her. She is so much fun and I love her videos, so definitely go check out hers for sure. I know that her and I both love historical fictions, so I had recently read a couple historical fiction books and I was like, ooh, I should do a rec video about this, and like, hey, it's the new year, like new ideas, do you want to collab and like do this together? So that's how this video kind of came about. So I have about 15 books to chat about today and recommend. So excited to get into these. The first ones are definitely historical fiction, and then towards the end I have some that are historical fiction, but they also might have elements of other genres as well, which I will explain when I get to those. So I myself am not a huge fan of historical fictions set around World War II. I feel like for me, those have just been so overdone in the years, like with different types of media, like TV shows and movies and books and everything. So while those are super popular for a reason, and I know that there are definitely audiences out there for them, majority of mine are not going to be that. I personally just don't like reading those ones. So I think maybe two of the ones I'm going to be talking about are kind of set around World War II time frame, but other than that, these are going to be some historical fictions that are not set around World War II. So first up, I'm going to be chatting about the two that kind of inspired this video, the two that I read recently. So the first one is Unsinkable by Jenny L. Walsh. This one just came out in January, and not gonna lie, the cover and the fact that this one takes place kind of around the Titanic is definitely what pulled me into this book. And I like how we get in here this story that kind of showcases the strength of two women in different times who kind of overcome all these obstacles in their life, and they continue to rise up despite their different circumstances. So in one of the timelines that we follow, we're following it in 1912, and we follow this woman who was based off of a real woman who was a survivor of Titanic, and she became known as Miss Unsinkable because she actually ended up surviving not just Titanic, but also two other shipwrecks as well. And in the second timeline, we're following a woman in 1942. She is learning and becoming a spy to work for the British and go work in France during World War II. And so that was super interesting as well to kind of see her take on this entire life and role and like go hardcore in the spy world. So yeah, we followed those two. Like I said, it's definitely a story of the strength of women who have overcome lots of different obstacles in their life. Next up is The Frozen River, and this one I know just came out recently as well. It was also one of the recent Book of the Month picks, I think for possibly December of 2023. So this one is historical fiction with mystery, and in here we follow this renowned midwife that lived during the 1780s in America. She was based off of a real life person. It talks about how she defied the legal system, and her journal entries became kind of part of history, that she kind of wrote herself into history because of those. So like I mentioned, the main character or the heroine in this one, she is a midwife and she lives in Maine in the late 1780s. And as a midwife, she's kind of privy to everything that happens in the town. She keeps extensive journal entries as well that she kind of treats like a diary, and her medical case files, but she really like tracks down everything that's going on, like the weather, the news, the crime, everything in town. And like I mentioned, she knows everything that's going on in the town because of being the midwife. So she's called for pregnancies and births, stillbirths, deaths, murders, crime, all the things. At the beginning of the story, we see a man's body getting pulled up, frozen in the ice out of the river, and she is called down there to kind of do a cause of death and examine the body. So when she does that, she realizes that it was actually a murder, and this man was actually one of two very like prominent men in town who have been recently accused of a rape. And so the story kind of picks up from there and gets super interesting. So like I mentioned, she treated her journal entries as kind of like diary entries and kept track of everything that's happened in town for years and years. So she finds herself being pulled into this like ongoing murder case now, as well as this sexual assault / rape case that's happening and being tried. This one is very long. I think it's like over 400 pages. So it does get a little tedious at times with that kind of like slice of life details in her journal entries, but I found it just super intriguing overall. I love that the heroine in here is a very strong woman. She works in the medical medical field. I mean, this is a time when women were not well respected or listened to, especially in the medical field. So I really appreciated that. As a romance reader as well, I really like the kind of side romance we get in here with the heroine and her husband. They're both in their 50s, but I love that their romance was still super strong and just very sweet and tender, and they are very much still into each other. Like, we don't get things on page, but like it's hinted at. I did really appreciate that as a romance reader. Next up is Girls of Flight City by Lorraine Heath. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, World War II historical fictions are not really my favorite, but when my favorite historical romance author writes one, I'm gonna pick it up and read it. One thing about World War II stories is I feel like we get a lot of the same story being told all the time, so I did appreciate in here how we get a different aspect of the war that I definitely did not know about. This book is based on true events where American women, who are known as the Girls of Flight City, hence the name of the book, who were actually training British Royal Air Force pilots during the height of World War II. So we see these British pilots who were stationed and trained in Texas during World War II, and these very strong, capable women being the ones who teach them how to fly. I loved meeting all the characters in here and the heroine as well. She's always dreamed of a career in aviation. I loved how she's a super talented flyer herself. She definitely has to fight for her job in the training field, and so I appreciated these very strong women who, you know, are super capable of their jobs and just need to be able to do them. We get moments in here as well with her younger sister, their brother who is off at war. We get heartbreaks and love and loss and kind of joy. I was just invested every step of the story. I definitely recommend this one. It is just so good. Next up is The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. So I have another one to recommend from this author as well. I feel like she's really popular, but for good reason. Like, her books are really good. This one in particular is probably my favorite I've read from her. So this one's a very hard and heartbreaking story that's set during the Great Depression in America, as well as the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl is a culmination of a time when economic depression and extended drought and times of unusually high temperatures, poor agricultural practices, and wind erosion were wrecking the southern plains of the United States. Times were super hard. People's crops and livestock were dying off. People were having a hard time making ends meet and just living and breathing throughout each day. This is definitely not a lighthearted story. I feel like that's kind of common with Kristen Hanna books. You definitely go through it with the story, but it's just such a powerful story of turmoil and depression and love and loss and heartbreak and kind of coming out of that and having hope at the end of it all. In here, we get a lot of a mother-daughter relationship as well, which I really appreciated. And here we follow the main character, Elsa, which basically she had rheumatic fever as a child, and so she has always kind of lived sheltered by her family, always very sick. They treat her as kind of frail and unable to do things. So kind of on her 25th birthday, she decides to break out of the house and kind of go out and enjoy a night of freedom. And some things along the way, she ends up meeting a guy there, and her entire life kind of changes after that. And it sets off a series of events, which is where we kind of pick up into the story and follow her and her daughter throughout their lives. I was just super invested into the story, seeing Elsa's resilience through it all and her strength as a mother for her children. I really liked learning about the Dust Bowl in here and the migrant experience in California at the time. This book is just definitely a kind of visceral experience, and I highly recommend. Next up, I have Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I actually was looking for my physical copy of this one and realized that my parents are currently borrowing it, so we're just gonna show the cover up here. I love Taylor Jenkins Reid. I know her books aren't for everybody, but I really appreciate them. I have read her entire backlist and just love her books. This one in particular, I don't see talked about quite that often, but I really love this one. So this one is set around tennis, and we start off in the 1980s following the main character, Carrie, when she is kind of this child prodigy in the tennis world. We see her rise to fame and her fall from that, and then eventually her trying to have this comeback. I feel like Taylor Jenkins Reid does a really good job at writing these kind of slightly abrasive, hard to like women as main characters, and I do really appreciate that about her writing. And here we get to follow Carrie's, like I said, her journey with her tennis. We also see her relationship with her father throughout the years, how that kind of ebbs and flows. I love seeing the story kind of come full circle in the end. This one actually brought me to tears at the end as well, which I was not expecting. I was invested in this one right from the start. I feel like by the 30% mark, I was like surprised the book still had pages left, not in that I was dreading getting to them, but just in the fact that so much had already happened in the story and I couldn't like believe what more was gonna happen. So yeah, definitely enjoy this one. I highly recommend this one on audiobook as well. There's a full cast narration and it is just done spectacularly. Next up, I have What the Wind Knows by Amy Harmon. This is one of my favorite historical fiction reads of all time. I love this book so much. When I grabbed it out to do this video, it made me really want to reread it, so I might be doing that tonight. This one, especially if you're a romance reader, I highly recommend picking it up. This book is just so like hauntingly beautiful, has like a very poetic and magical feel to the writing that I just ate up. So this is one of those books that will stick with you as well. I read this book like over 5 years ago and I vividly remember scenes from it still. This one, like I said, it is historical fiction. We also get time travel in here, which was just done like chef's kiss so well. I really loved it. And here, the main main character that we follow, or the heroine, I feel like we pick up the story kind of in the early 2000s, and then we end up going back in time traveling back to Ireland in the 1920s. This one is centered around the Irish Revolution and kind of the politics behind the Irish Rebellion. Like I said, we do get a romance in here. I loved the family aspect to the story, and just definitely one I recommend everybody picking up. Next up is Where the Lost Wander by Amy Harmon again. I feel like when I find good authors that I love their books, I usually read a bunch of their backlist. So you're gonna see like a couple authors in here mentioned quite a few times, but I mean, they are good for a reason. So this story was super unique and interesting. First of all, I think the cover is so beautiful. Just love that moment. In here, this story follows a young woman and her family as they travel across the Oregon Trail. I feel like this is a common theme with a lot of these historical fictions, but in here we follow kind of the struggles of the characters, their love, their loss, their joy, their hardships. We see their pain, and at the end of it all, we see the hope that they have on this kind of like epic adventure that they're on. This one again, I feel like Amy Harmon's writing is just so hauntingly beautiful. Like that's the best way I can describe her books. They sit with you for quite some time after you finish the story. The author's note here at the end was super fun to read about. This book is actually based off of Amy Harmon, the author's real life husband, and his like 5 times great grandfather, which I thought was so cool and unique. So yeah, if you want an author who kind of gives you those emotional feels as well to the historical fiction, but also has like beautiful writing, definitely check out Amy Harmon. All right, next up I have Magical Lessons by Alice Hoffman. This is actually a prequel, the very first prequel to the Practical Magic series. This series, while it's definitely appreciated as a whole, I feel like you can totally read this as a standalone. This was actually the book that I read first in her Practical Magic series when it came out. I will say I did have some knowledge of the Practical Magic world just because of the movie like in the 90s that I watched a couple times back then. And so yeah, I jumped into this one only having watched the movie and loved this book so much. This one basically goes back to the beginning of the Owens family. I feel like if you love historical fiction but also want something with like witches and magic, and we get some of the Salem witch trial era, this book is definitely it. So yeah, this book takes us back to the 1600s and we follow Maria Owens, who was kind of the start of the Owens family that the whole series follows. In here we get her journey of kind of love and loss and spells and magic woven throughout her entire story of these very strong women in this family. And if you do end up loving Magical Lessons, I highly recommend picking up this next prequel in the series, which is The Rules of Magic. This one takes place in the 1960s, and again, it is just so good, so beautiful. I actually love the prequels to the series more than Practical Magic. Ugh. Love them so much. Next up is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I feel like most people have already read this book or have watched the new like Amazon Prime show that came out last year, which is so good. I appreciated it for what it was itself, but I also love the book on its own as well. But if you haven't read this one yet, I definitely recommend picking it up. If you want historical fiction, but like 1970s sex, drugs, rock and roll, this is that book. This one I will recommend is best appreciated in audiobook format. This has a full cast narration. I know the audiobook has won multiple awards. It is just done so well. I highly recommend reading it in that format. This book is told in kind of like interview format where we kind of meet with different band members and get their stories. So yeah, in audiobook format, it is just chef's kiss. Like I said, this is told in interview format where we're following this band from the 1970s. They are a fictional band, but I swear throughout this book, you're going to feel like they're so real and you're going to be looking them up. In here, we see the different band members kind of being interviewed separately, and we see them reminiscing about how their band got started. We see everybody's account of what went down with the band, the highs, the lows, who wrote what songs, who had massive egos, the fights, the cheating, the love, the hate, the drama, the secrets, the marriages, the divorces, the music, the award shows, the addiction, the sobriety, the tears, and just overall the friendship. This one starts off a little bit slow in the beginning. It is hard to get used to if you're not used to reading like books told in an interview format, but by the last 10%, you're going to be so invested and riveted to your seat. This one definitely had me crying. Like I said, I loved the book when I first read it. I did really love the adaptation that Amazon Prime did as well of the TV show. I thought it was done so well. Like I said, it's very different, but I feel like I could keep them in separate boxes. Like I can love the book for what it is and I can love the TV show for what it is. So yeah, if you've read it or watched it, definitely let me know your thoughts as well. So next up are 2 historical fiction books that I feel like are super popular for a good reason. They're just so good, but I couldn't not talk about them as well. So first up is The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna. If you don't know, I live in Alaska, and this book actually takes place in Alaska in the 1970s and 1980s. It follows that kind of homesteader life of living off of the land, and it very much showcases the very like harsh harsh but beautiful setting of Alaska. In this story, we follow kind of the main character is this teenage girl who we meet when her family is picking up their life and moving out of the city, leaving all of their possessions behind and taking off to Alaska. Her father had kind of come back from war, and a lot of people during this time actually had this very like romanticized version of Alaska. I feel like people still do to a certain degree, but they came up here totally unprepared for the very harsh weather and conditions that they were going to be living in. So in here we get their story of survival and resilience while kind of living off of the grid in Alaska and all the hardships that that brought. I will say this book I had a really hard time with at the beginning of the story. I was honestly tempted to put it down because it hurt so much, and I was like, why do I want to read about this pain and suffering? But I am so glad I stuck with it because it is just so good. Just know there is content warning in here for a lot of domestic abuse, so definitely know that going in. Like I said, it's really beautiful. I loved in here as well how there was a lot of places that I'm familiar with and spend my summers at, so I kind of loved seeing that. The author has some connections to up here as well, so that was super cool to see in the author's note. So yeah, highly recommend this one if you haven't picked it up yet. So another super popular one that I feel like so many people have read, but I wanted to chat about it, is The Giver of Stars. I love this book. Like, this is one of those books where I stayed up until 4 in the morning reading it in one sitting. I just couldn't put it down. This book is set in rural Kentucky in the late 1930s, and we follow this group of women who become known as the Pack Horse Librarians of Kentucky. This program was started by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a first lady of the country, and it was a program that she set up to bring books and education to people who were definitely living a very rural life, living in the hills and the Appalachian countryside of Kentucky. I had never heard about these women or this kind of historical aspect to it, so I was super intrigued and really loved this one. So basically in here, the women would carry by horseback like books to different people, kind of like a little free library, but like a traveling library. It's a coal mining community, and we see these kind of heroines and these women's lives in this very like man-dominated world. We see their relationships and their marriages, the poverty that they face, the friendships they make along the way, the small-minded people of the town, and how important like books and education are and were and still are. I feel like the story and the journey, the characters, their friendships, like it is set during Depression era in Kentucky. It was just so good and captivating. I loved in here as well. As a romance reader, we get a sweet little romance in here happening that I couldn't get enough of. So yeah, definitely check this one out if you haven't yet for some reason. So at the beginning of the video, I mentioned there were some at the end that I was going to share that are historical fiction, but they also blend other genres as well into them. So I'm going to recommend those as well because I really enjoyed a lot of these. So first up is Lone Women, and this one, love the cover. That is actually what grabbed me to the story. I thought this one was so cool and unique. This is basically historical fiction, but it also is this blend of part mystery, a little bit of horror, like a dash of kind of paranormal or supernatural as well. And here we follow the main character who ends up leaving her California home after her family ends up passing away, like her parents and I believe her sister as well. And it's set in like the 1910s in America, and she ends up heading off to Montana, which there was this little like historical tidbit in here about women during that time who were either single or divorced, deserted, widowed women who were all over the age of 21 could head to Montana, homestead there for like a year. I think they had to prove that they could live off of the land, and then they would be able to own the land that they were living on. So that is what the heroine in here sets off to do. This one has a very foreboding vibe to it the whole time because while on her journey, she's traveling with this trunk that she has to make sure is protected and closed at all times. She's very protective over it, and yeah, things kind of go from there. I really enjoyed this one. Like, I feel like it grabbed my attention right away because I wanted to know what was happening. So if you want like a little bit of a horror, kind of paranormal, supernaturally feel to it, definitely check this one out. Next up, I have The Kingdom of Back. I absolutely love this cover. That is what first grabbed my attention. I think it is so just stunning. So the cover is definitely what had me picking up this book. I loved it so much. I think it's so beautiful. And here we get historical fiction, but it's also mixed with a little bit of magical realism and fantasy as well. And here we follow the story of the older sister of Wolfgang Mozart and kind of the little known facts about her in life, which she was actually a child prodigy herself, much like her brother. She wanted to become an acclaimed composer, but the time that she was living in, that was definitely not acceptable / wasn't available for women to do, sadly. This takes place in the 18th century in Europe, and so at that time, women could not compose, sadly. This book is just really beautiful, and I loved the story of this woman who maybe isn't acknowledged, isn't remembered, like getting to have her story and be remembered and not be forgotten. Just really beautiful if you want like more historical fiction with magical realism and fantasy to it. Highly recommend this one. So the next one is kind of in that same vein. So this is Gods of Jaden Shadow by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. I've read quite a few books from this author and always just enjoy her writing. This one, like I said, it's going to be historical fiction, but it also mixes this kind of like fairy tale aspect. We get Mayan mythology, magical realism, Mexican folklore, kind of like YA feeling. The story is set in the Yucatan in Mexico in the 1920s, and we follow this young woman who has dreams of kind of living a grander, better life than she's currently in. She's definitely one of those strong women who is capable and determined to kind of figure out her own life. She ends up in kind of a bad circumstance, but she finds this old chest of her grandfather's and opens it up. And so when she does that, she accidentally frees the spirit of the Mayan god of death. And so it kind of goes from there, very much this like journey and adventure story. Like I said, I really enjoyed this one, but it's going to be historical fiction, but mixed with like magical realism and Mayan mythology and folklore and all of that. All right, so those are all the historical fiction recs that I have for you today. Let me know in the comments if you have read any of these. If you have any historical fiction recs for me, I would love to know. I'm always in the mood to pick something else up. Definitely go check out Tori's video as well. I can't wait to see what books she recommended as well. Hopefully with both of these videos, you got some new books to check out yourself. So definitely let me know if you do that. If you want to leave me an emoji in the comments to let me know you watched the video, maybe put something like rainbowy, since I have my Babe Support Babes sweatshirt on today. So yeah, like a rainbow emoji, anything like that. So thanks so much for watching today. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my future videos, and I will see you in my next one.